الحمد لله وحده والصلاة والسلام على من لا نبي بعد نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه ومن اقتفى أثره واستنى بسنته إلى يوم الدين. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما إلى علمنا ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. Inshallah, we'll continue with the book known as al-Awsat fi Sunani or min al-Sunani wal-Ijma'i wal-Ikhtilaf, that medium-sized book that contains the Sunan, the narrations of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam that deal with halal and haram, as well as the ijma', the consensus of the scholars, and their disagreement. That was authored by Abu Bakr Muhammad ibn Ibrahim ibn al-Mundhir, rahimahullah ta'ala rahmatan wasi'ah, who died in the year 318. And we're in the section of his book which he titles Kitaab al-Miyaah, the section that deals with the various types of water. And we've talked about the types of water in general: tahur, tahir, and najis. Tahur water being that water that remains the way that Allah created it in reality, or according to our determinations. It removes hadith and najasah, so it is pure and purifying. The second category being tahir water. And tahir water is that water that has changed its taste, color, or smell because of mixing with something that is pure. And we said that this is the water that there's disagreement about regarding its reality. Is it purifying or not? And the author mentioned some of the categories of tahir water. And there are other categories besides that which its taste, color, or smell changes because of something pure, like water that has been used in a obligatory purification from hadith. And the author, he doesn't get into every single detail, but he covers a large portion of them. And then the third category of water is that which is known as al-Ma' al-Najis, Islamically impure water, water that is najis, that is impure. And najis water, generally speaking, is water that its taste, color, or smell have changed because of something najis. And then there are other categories of najis water that are disagreed about amongst the scholars, like water that is small in amount that comes into contact with something that is najis. And that is the chapter that the author has for us today. Dhikrul ma al-qalil tukhalituhu najasa. What has been mentioned regarding a small amount of water that is mixed with something najis. And this chapter is long, it's lengthy, because this is outside of tahir water, probably the most debated concept in water. So when it comes to the things that there's a lot of disagreement surrounding them in the category or the chapter of water, then there is the effectiveness of tahir water in purification and its definition, as well as the different categories of najis water, specifically the small amount of water that comes into contact with something najis. And so this chapter is lengthy. It starts on page 368 and ends on page 282. So that's 6 pages away from 20. So that's 14 pages in this section or this topic, this mas'ala. And so it's unlikely that we'll finish it all today, but perhaps we'll take the first people's view with their evidence and maybe the second as well. Once again, the chapter that is in front of us, Dhikrul Ma al-Qalil, or Dhikrul Ma al-Qalil tukhalituhu najasa. What has been mentioned regarding a small amount of water that is mixed with something najis. And so, al-Ma al-Qalil, the first thing we need to know is, what is a small amount of water? And this is an issue. This is an issue where there is disagreement. There is no precise definition in the religion to quantify what is a little bit and what is a lot. And so scholars, they have varying views regarding what is considered a little bit and what is considered a lot of water. Although the famous opinion, the more popular opinion, is that a lot of water is qullatan, 2 qulla. And they also disagree if this is a lot of water, 2 qulla, how much is a qulla? And the popular opinion regarding a qulla is that it is every 2 qulla are 90 sa of water. 2 qulla are 90 sa. So 90 of these would equal qullatan. It would equal a large amount of water. And if I'm not mistaken, it's approximately somewhere in the range of about 40 gallons. If I'm not mistaken, I'd have to go back to my notes, and perhaps the author will mention it, or maybe I've written it in my footnotes here. But I'll have to go back in my notes. So inshallah, in the comment section, I'll add some of the statements of the scholars about what is, the popular opinion regarding what is qullatan. And like we say, there's no precise answer, right? Scholars disagree what is a little bit and what is a lot. And just like they disagree is how much is a qulla, right? Khamsu kirab, right? It's 5 buckets, and that's qullatan. Every qulla is 2.5 kirba. And they say it's about 90 sa, which is about 40 gallons, if I'm not mistaken. Naam. That being said, this chapter is what has been mentioned regarding a small amount of water, tukhalituhu najaasah, that is mixed with something najis. And we talked about the ways that water can be affected. It can be affected by proximity, which does not render the water najis by consensus. If the water's taste, color, or smell changes because of proximity, not because of mixing, then the water retains its status. And then you have al-mudakhala bighayri mumazaja, or min ghayri mumazij, where you have something that is placed into the water but does not mix with it, where it and the water are separable, divisible after the item is placed into the water, like a stone, like wood, like a block of perfume, things that don't actually mix and dissolve. They can be put into the water, but they don't mix with the water. Then you have the water changing because of mixing, something that is placed into the water and then dissolves and mixes with it until it is inseparable, indivisible from the water. And this is mukhalata, right? Al-mumazaja, that something mixes in totality with the water until they become as one. And then you have the change that can occur in the water by its own accord. The water changes of its own. And so these are the different changes. And the author here is talking about what has been mentioned regarding a small amount of water that is mixed with something najis, i.e. something that is najis, regardless if it's a lot or a little bit, comes into contact with this small amount of water. What does it do to the water? And does it remove its effectiveness from purification? Does it remove its effectiveness in purification? And does it matter if the water changes its qualities of taste, color, or smell or not? When the water is a small amount, does it matter if the water changes or not? These are the conversations that the author is going to tackle in this topic. And so he says, and as the author does, right? This book is Kitab al-Awsat fi Sunan, the narrations of the Prophet and the consensus, the agreement of the scholars and their disagreement. So before mentioning their disagreement, the author, rahimahullah ta'ala, is going to get us all on the same footing by mentioning points that they agree in. And we've mentioned that Ibn al-Mundhir, from the things that he was very skilled in, was awareness of the consensus, the ijma' of the scholars. And he has a book in this topic. And even though there are some criticisms about some of the things that he asserts a consensus for, you found that the people have not stopped benefiting from his book and consensus and considering it to be one of the fundamental works in the field. And so Ibn al-Mundhir, he starts off by saying, أجمع أهل العلم على أن الماء القليل أو الكثير إذا وقعت فيه نجاسة فغيرت النجاسة للماء طعما أو لونا أو ريحا أنه نجس ما دام كذلك ولا يجزئ الوضوء والاغتسال. Ibn al-Mundhir, he says that the people of knowledge are in unanimous agreement that whenever water, whether it be small in quantity or large, comes, or whenever water has some form of najasa that falls into it, and this najasa changes the water's taste, color, or smell, then this water is najis as long as that remains the case. And therefore, it is not sufficient in making a wudu or a ghusl. The people of knowledge are in unanimous agreement that water, whether it be small in quantity or abundant, if something that is najis comes into contact with it and changes changes for the water its taste, color, or smell, then that water becomes najis as long as that remains the case, and it is not sufficient to make wudu or a ghusl with it. So this is something that the people of knowledge are in unanimous agreement about. If the water's taste, color, or smell changes, regardless of how much or how little the water is, then that water is considered najis if the thing that changed its taste, color, or smell is something that is najis. And it will remain to be najis until that change goes away, whether it be through one of the purification techniques or if it goes away on its own accord. That is the only time that the water can be deemed non-najis, after its taste, color, or smell has changed because of something najis. And this is regardless if it is abundant or small in amount. He mentions another consensus. He says, وأجمعوا على أن الماء الكثير مثل الرجل من البحر ونحو ذلك إذا وقعت فيه نجاسة فلم تغير له لونا ولا طعما ولا ريحا أنه بحاله في الطهارة قبل أن تقع فيه النجاسة. He says they are also in agreement that water, when it is abundant, like the canal or like the branch of, the offshoot of a sea, الرجل من البحر. They say in the footnotes, الرجل من البحر خليجه, like the Gulf of a Kira', right? It's like the Gulf of when a sea, like the Gulf of Mexico, it comes off the ocean, which the Arabs, they might call the sea as well, and it makes that little gulf between the land, the water that's surrounded on three sides by land, then that's considered a gulf. And so when water is a large amount, like a gulf or something similar, then he goes on to say, if najasa falls into it and it does not change its color, taste, or smell, then the water continues in its condition of purification, just as it was before the najasa fell into it. So if you have a large body of water and najasa gets into it, but nothing changes about the water, then that water is the way that it was before the najasa fell into it. And if the water changes for large bodies of water, if water changes on one side or one portion of the water, but doesn't change on the other portion, I say, and we'll mention this later, that the portion that has not changed remains in its pure state. And so here, the author has given us some things that there is agreement about. Now he's going to mention the point of the chapter, and he's going to mention those things that are disagreed about. And so he says, اختلفوا في الماء القليل تحل فيه نجاسة لم تغير للماء لونا ولا طعما ولا ريحا فقالت طائفة إذا كان الماء قلتين لم يحمل خبثا روي ذلك عن ابن عمر وسعيد بن جبير ومجاهد وبه قال الشافعي وأحمد وإسحاق وأبو عبيد وأبو ثور. Ibn al-Mundhir rahimahullah ta'ala, he says, and the scholars, they are in disagreement regarding a small amount of water that something najis settles into, but the water doesn't change as it relates to its color, taste, or smell. So a group of scholars say that if the water is at least kullatain, if the water is at least 2 kulla, then it cannot be rendered filthy. And this is what was reported on the authority of Ibn Umar and Sa'id ibn Jubair and Mujahid, and it was also the statement of Ash-Shafi'i and Ahmed and Ishaq, as well as Abu Ubaid and Abu Thawr. So this first group of scholars, they say that if something falls into najis water, if something falls into a small quantity of water, but the water's condition does not change. It doesn't change its taste, its color, or its smell. But we know that there is something mixed into the water that is impermissible, that is najis. Here, the first group of scholars say that the water, if it's at least 2 kulla, it doesn't become najis. And by implication, if it is less than 2 kulla, it does become najis. So they say that if there's a small amount of water, it becomes najis by simply coming into contact with something najis. And he says that this is what was reported on the authority of Ibn Umar, as well as Sa'id ibn Jubair from the students of Ibn Abbas, as well as Mujahid likewise. And it was also the statement of Ash-Shafi'i and Ahmed and Ishaq, yani Ishaq ibn Rahuya, and Abu Ubaid al-Qasim ibn Salam, and Abu Thawr. All of them held this view, that if the water is small in amount, less than qullatain, and it just by coming into contact with something najis, it automatically becomes najis itself. And let's take an example. Let's say I had this container full of water, a large amount, perhaps half a gallon, but not an abundance of water, according to the view of the scholars who say that a lot of water is qullatain. And let's say that some droplets of urine or something najis in nature were to get into the water without changing any of the water's qualities. Then this first opinion, even though the water looks, smells, and would taste the same, they would say the fact that something najis came into contact with it, the water is najis and must be poured out. This is the view of the majority. This is the view of the majority of the scholars as it relates to the schools of thought. And a practical application of this point would be if you wash your clothes in a washing machine, right? Especially the soaking cycle, right? More than the rinse cycle, but the soaking cycle. If there was something najis on your clothes, then the water in the soaking cycle would become najis and thus make all of your clothes najis. And so it would be particularly difficult to clean your clothes with a washing machine based on this view. Allahumma except because of the rinse cycle, but even in the rinse cycle, there's some conversations that could be had. So this is the first view. He mentions the foundation of this. He says, حدثنا علي بن عبد العزيز قال حدثنا أبو نعيم عن عبد السلام عن عبد السلام عن ليث عن مجاهد عن ابن عمر رضي الله تعالى عنه أنه قال إذا كان الماء قدر قلتين لم ينجسه شيء. He says that Ali ibn Abdul Aziz narrated to us on the authority of Abu Nu'aym. I'm sorry. He says that Ali ibn Abdul Aziz narrated to us. He said that Abu Nu'aym narrated to us on the authority of Abd Salam, on the authority of Layth, yani Layth ibn Sa'd, on the authority of Mujahid, yani Mujahid ibn Jabr, on the authority of Ibn Umar, yani Abdullah ibn Umar. Abdullah ibn Umar, he said, when water reaches the amount of 2 qullah, it doesn't carry filth, or nothing can filthify it. Nothing can make it filthy. And so this here, it's being reported as the statement of Ibn Umar. Now, it's also a hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but as we'll see, there is disagreement about its validity. But it is a statement of the Sahaba as well. And so the reality is that this narration is authentic, inshallah. The point of it is that this is the foundation of this view, that if water is qullatain, it doesn't become najis unless it changes because of something najis. Whereas if water is less than qullatain, just by simply coming into contact with it, it becomes najis. And as we said, and the author's going to have a chapter on this, there is a lot of disagreement about what is considered a lot of water. And even though the majority say that it is qullatain, there is a lot of disagreement about what is qullatain. How much water is it? But he goes on to say regarding this first view, واختلفوا في قدر قلتين ففي الحديث الذي ذكره ابن جريج قال رأيت قلال حجر فإذا القلة تسع قربتين أو قربتين وشيء أو 9 قربتين فإذا القلة 9 قربتين أو قربتين وشيء. He says that the scholars, they disagree about what is considered 2 qullah. So here he's going to mention the disagreement about what is a lot of water, what is a little bit of water. And he's going to start off defining what is qullatain. And you have to remember that this is something that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he did not specify or articulate clearly. There are only istinbatat, like assertions that people derive from the evidence and the text or the history, but there's no clear-cut answer. And so here he says they disagree, the people who hold this view that water that is less than qullatain can become najis by simple contact, they disagree about the amount of qullatain. So in the hadith that was mentioned by Ibn Jurayj, Abdul Malik ibn Abdul Aziz ibn Jurayj, this from the scholars of the Atba' al-Tabi'in, he died in the year 158, if I'm not mistaken. Ibn Jurayj, he says, I saw the qilal of Hajar, right? The qilal, the buckets, the qullah, I saw the ones that they used to use. These people from the area known as Hajar. Or is it Hujr? Qilal Hujr. Hujr is the area around Mecca. Let's get a good definition for you. Trying to find a good quality definition. So Mamlakatu Hujr, it was an old kingdom in the Eastern Arabian portion in Eastern Arabia. I'm trying to see the areas that it included, and my phone has been very problematic recently. Some of them say it's like the area that is currently nowadays al-Awsat in Saudi Arabia. And it used to be one of the seats of power in the region. And so the measurement system would go according to the places of power and dominance. And so because that was the historical place of dominance from the Arabs, the al-Ariba, the original Arab, that's the one of the metrics that they would use. And so Ibn Jurayj, he's saying, I saw the qilal, the buckets that were attributed to the people of Hujr. And I saw that a qulla, right, one qulla would fill about 2 qurba, right? And a qurba was a bucket or a pail or something that they would use. And so Ibn Jurayj says that I saw that a qulla would fill about 2 of the smaller buckets. One qulla, you could use 2 smaller buckets known as a qurba to fill it, or 2 buckets and a little bit extra, right? So according to Ibn Jurayj, a qulla, right, was approximately 2 kirba or 2 kirba or qurba and a little bit, 2 and some. And so we see how unprecise this measurement is, right? It's not something that is legislated by wahi. It's anecdotal. But this is what Ibn Jurayj said. From what he witnessed, from what he observed, a kulla could fill about 2 kirba or 2 and a little bit of a kirba. And so we have to know how much is a kirba. And, also we don't know how much is the little bit extra that he was referring to. And so we see off the bat that 2 qulla can be particularly hard to identify even during the time of the tabi'een or the atba' tabi'een. Now, that's the first opinion, that a qulla is about 2 buckets or 2 and some change. And so therefore a qullatain would be 4 buckets to about 4 and some change, almost 5. That's the first opinion about how much a qullatain is. He says, وَفِيهِ قَوْلٌ ثَانٍ. There's a second opinion as well. قال هو الشافعي. قال والاحتياط أن تكون القلة قربتين ونصفا. فإذا كان الماء 5 قرب لم يحمل نجسا في جر كان أو غيره. وقرب الحجاز كبار. لا يكون الماء الذي لا يحمل النجاسة إلا بقرب كبار. Here he says there's a second view as it relates to how much is in qullatain, and it's what was said by Ash-Shafi'i. Ash-Shafi'i, rahimahullah ta'ala, who would be from the generation after Ibn Jurayj, right? Ash-Shafi'i was born in the year 150. Ibn Jurayj died in the year 158. And Ash-Shafi'i is outside of the Atba' al-Tabi'in, right? He is from the generation directly after the Sigar of the Atba' al-Tabi'in. Ash-Shafi'i, he says that safety would dictate that qullatain should be considered to be 2.5 buckets. Right, when we talk about a qulla, this metric that they would measure their water by. And the word kulla, as we'll see, it comes from the meaning of al-istiqlal, something that is able to either be removed single-handedly by somebody, or it comes from al-istiqlal, which means a body of water or an amount of water that can stand on its own. إِمَّا مَا يَسْتَقِلُّ بِهِ الرَّجُلُ فَيَحْمِلُهُ, that which a person can take on his own and move it, or it's from the meaning of an amount of water that is sufficient on its own. It's able to stand on its own in its amount. So this is what the word kulla means, and there's no way to translate it. And there's no, in reality, preserved reality of it. And so it's just something you have to know with the word. You have to just know this Arabic word, kulla. And you try to figure out by approximation and investigation about how much it might be. And so Ibn Jurayj, the first opinion is that a kulla is about 2 kirba. And a kirba is a bucket, a pail, a pot, a container. And once again, this is imprecise. How big is the pot? How much does it hold? But Ibn Jurayj says it's about 2 containers for every kulla, to 2 and some change. So kullatain would be between 4 and 5 buckets. A Shafi'i, he says no. Safety would dictate that we make every single kulla 2.5 buckets. Ibn Jurayj says it's 2 buckets to 2 buckets and some change. Safety would just say make the change half. Anything less than half, round up to half. And so a Shafi'i, he rounded up and said that 1 kulla is 2.5 buckets. And therefore kullatain would be 5 buckets. And so a Shafi'i, he says, when water reaches 5 buckets, then it is not affected by Najaasah, i.e. by simply coming into Najaasah, into contact with Najaasah, without changing. If water reaches 5 buckets, then it is not affected by Najaasah, whether that water be in a pitcher, or in some other vessel, or contained some other way, right? It doesn't matter if you have a big basin that holds that amount of water, or if it's a freestanding body of water, as long as it's approximated to be about 5 buckets, then that water is considered to be kullatain. And a Shafi'i, he goes on to explain these buckets. He says, in the buckets of the area of Hijaz, and Hijaz is that area, Mecca, Medina, Ta'if, Jeddah, that area is known as the Hijaz. He says that the buckets of Hijaz were large buckets. So don't think that the buckets that he's referring to are small buckets. No, they're large buckets. And he says, وَلَا يَكُونُ الْمَاء, and it is not the case as it relates to the water that does not become najis by contact, except that it be valued or it be measured by large buckets. So when we say kullatain is 5 buckets, the only way that we can approximate this is by the buckets that were used in the area of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Mecca, Medina, right? And those buckets were large buckets. And so this kullatain has to be about 5 large buckets. Like, there's no precision. There's no way for me to tell you, is this or isn't this kullatain or not. We have to find artifacts and things like that to see if we can still find some of the buckets or the measurements of some of the buckets that might have been used during the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The good news is that scholars put effort into this, and they've recorded it and measured it, as we'll see. Ibn al-Mundhir, he goes on, he says, وَفِيهِ قَوْلٌ ثَالِث. There's also a third position about how much is qullatayn. Right, we have 4 buckets and some change. We have 5 buckets. He says, وَفِيهِ قَوْلٌ ثَالِث حُكِيَ أَنْ أَحْمِدْ قَوْلَانِ أَحَدُهُمَا أَنَّ الْقُلَّةَ قُرْبَتَانِ وَالْآخِرُ أَنَّ الْقُلَّتَيْنِ خَمْسُ قِرَبْ وَلَمْ يَقُلْ بِأَيِّ قِرَبْ. He says there's a third position, and this third position is actually that which was reported on Imam Ahmed, who has 2 positions in this issue. Imam Ahmed, rahimahullah, he has 2 varying opinions in this topic as it relates to what is qullatayn. The first of them is that a qulla is 2 buckets, similar to what Ibn Jurayj said. He says, and the second is that qullatayn is 5 buckets, similar to what Ash-Shafi'i said. Why is this 2 different positions? Why is this a third position if it's just repeating the first position? It's because Imam Ahmed did not specify the volume of the bucket or the quality, the size of the bucket. If it's a bucket and you fill up 5 of them, it's qullatayn. If it's a bucket and you fill up 4 of them, it's qullatayn. And so Imam Ahmed's position differs from Shafi'i's in the fact that he didn't specify the type of bucket that needed to be used. That's the third opinion. وَفِيهِ قَوْلٌ رَابِعٌ. There is a fourth opinion in this issue. قَالَهُ إِسْحَاقٌ. Right, we're seeing all the people that he mentioned that had this view. You see them all still differing about how much is qullatayn. And remember, this first view is that if water reaches qullatayn, then coming into contact with najaasah doesn't affect it. But if it's lesser than qullatayn, then just simply coming into contact with najaasah affects it. But we already see that there's so much disagreement about, well, what is qullatayn? He says, well, fihi qawlun rabi'. There's a fourth statement regarding this. قاله إسحاق قال أما الذي نعتمد عليه إذا كان الماء قلتين وهما نحو 6 قرب لأن القلة نحو الخابية. The fourth position is that which was reported or that which was stated by Ishaq, yani Ishaq ibn Rahuya. He says, as far as that which we rely on in this issue, or as far as what would we substantiate in this topic, it is the fact that, or it is the view that if water reaches qullatayn, and qullatan are 6 buckets, because a qulla in our view is similar to the khabiyah. And a khabiyah is a al-hub, وهي الجرة الكبيرة. It's a large pitcher. A jurra is a pitcher, right? Let's see if I can. This is what my mind goes to when I see it. And perhaps your mind will as well, right? Something like this one, right? This is a jurra. And so Ishaq ibn Rahuya is saying that about 6 buckets equals a qullatan, because qullatan, or 1 qulla, is approximately a khabiyah. And a khabiyah is that big pitcher, right? That big one that you would sit on the floor, right? I think that the people who sell like olive oil and things like that, they still use them today. Those big floor sitting pitchers, not the kind that you would, pour a drink out of, but something that would be big and on the floor. And so this is what Ishaq is saying, that a qullatan is 6 buckets. So that's the fourth position. وفيه قول خامس, and there's a fifth position. وهو أن القلتين 5 قرب ليس بأكبر القرب ولا بأصغرها. هذا قول أبي ثور. He says there's a fifth position, and this fifth position is that qullatani are 5 buckets. But the buckets should not be the largest buckets, nor should they be the smallest buckets. They should be average size buckets. So this position differs from Shafi'i and Ahmed, because Shafi'i said they have to be the large buckets, while Ahmed said it doesn't matter, while Abi Thawr, which is the one who has this opinion, is saying that the buckets should be average size, medium-sized buckets. But no matter which of them you say, we still are suffering from the same problem, and that is a lack of precision regarding something that the religion would be contingent upon. And anything that the religion would be contingent upon, then know for sure there should be clarity in it. طيب. وفيه قول سادس. There's also a sixth position. وهو أنها الحباب or الحباب وأنها الحباب وهي قلال حجر معروفة مستفيضة سمعنا ذلك في أشعارهم ولم يجعل لذلك حدا هذا قول أبي عبيد. Now Abu Ubaid al-Qasim ibn Salam, who was one of the scholars of the language as well as hadith, he says that the qullatan are the large hubab. And the word hubab is the plural of the word hub. And the hub is that large pitcher that we were just mentioning a second ago. And so Abu Ubaid, he says that the qulla are those big hubab, those khabiyah, those big pitchers. And this is what is known as qilalu hujr. Let's see. I don't think so, but let's see if we can see, is there any Google concept of qilalu hujr? And this is something you have to be careful with, because Google and AI and things like that nowadays, they're not necessarily accurate historically, right? And so you want to look at what source they're referencing and things like that. But just to put in your mind, right, these are the type of images that come up, right? But Allah knows best. This is where you would have to do research and study to see, are there any artifacts, to see did anybody record measurements. A lot of times the measurements, they would measure them by like grains of wheat or arm spans or hand spans and things like that. But even in that, it still leads to impreciseness, a lack of precision, that if it was the religion, there might have been some specificity mentioned in it. Anyway, Abu Ubaid, he says that the qulla or the qilal, they are the hubab. These pitchers that we're talking about are the large pitchers. This is the qilal hujr. These are the pitchers or the containers that the people of Hujr used. And they are well known and popular. This is what Abu Ubaid says. And this is, problematic for us, because they might have been well known and popular to their time period, but for us, not so much so. He says, we have heard them referencing them, i.e. these type of pictures, in their poetry. And they have not given any specifications or dimensions regarding them. This is the statement of Abu Ubaid, right? Their pictures, they just were known, right? If I tell you to get a bucket, right, depending on, what kind of, craft you're in, what kind of field you're in, maybe as Americans, the first thing our mind defaults to is a 5-gallon bucket, right? That's if I say, go to the store and buy me some buckets, the first thing you would get me, it would be a 5-gallon bucket. But if you're a housewife, the first thing you might get me might be a mop bucket, right? I envision the, the little gray bucket with the handle that you put the mop in. And so even though, nowadays we have precision in some of our measurements, back then it was just known, go give me a bucket. Okay, they would get you this normal sized bucket. And so that's what Abu Ubaid is saying, is that a kulla is a hub. And this hub are these well-known, famous size buckets. So he wouldn't even break it down to another means of measurement. He would just say that the qullatain are two well-known, or it's a well-known metric. طيب وفيه قول سابع. And there's also a seventh position. وهو أن القلة الجرة. وكذلك قال عبد الرحمن بن مهدي ووكيع ويحيى بن آدم ولم يجعلوا لذلك حدا يوقف عليه. A seventh position in this issue is that the kulla is a pitcher. So it's similar, but a jurra might be smaller than a hub, right? A hub is al-jurratul kabira. This hub that Abu Ubaid and that that Ishaq were referring to, it's a hub, it's a large pitcher. But here, the seventh view is that a kulla is just a pitcher without it being the large sized ones. He says, and this is the view of Abdul Rahman ibn Mahdi. Abdul Rahman ibn Mahdi from the Sigar al-Tabi'een, and likewise Waki' from them as well as Yahya ibn Adam. And they did not give any specific dimensions or definitions to its size that we can, measure it by. They just approximated, just, a pitcher. So a kulla, one kulla is one pitcher. So it's not two buckets. It's not one large pitcher. One kulla is just a pitcher. طيب وفيه قول ثامن. Right? It's exhausting, but this is knowledge. But it's also beneficial because just seeing the volume of their disagreement in this issue, it just reinforces the fact that no, it can't be the right answer, because there's too much disagreement in it. And for something that is from the basics of the religion, Allah and his messenger would have clarified it. And so it strengthens the position that we'll get to eventually, that all water is pure. Nothing makes it najis unless its taste, color, or smell changes. And it doesn't matter if it's a lot or a little, because there is no definition of a lot or a little. There's no religious precision regarding defining a lot or a little. And all of these people's statements are exactly that, people's statements. And people's statements do not equate legislation. And so this eighth position, he says, وَهُوَ أَنَّ الْكُلَّ قَدْ يُقَالْ لِلْكُوز. Allahu Akbar. حكى قبيصة عن الثوري أن الثوري صلى خلفه في شهر رمضان ثم أخذ نعله وقلة معه ثم خرج. طيب. He says, and there is an eighth statement in this, an eighth statement, and it is that a kulla, it could be said for a mug. Remember, we talked about the other day a kuz, and we said a kuz is like a container like this, but with the handle. A container like this that would have the handle, like we call in English a mug, a coffee cup, right? This could be called a kulla. And the aspect of this being called a kulla is what we mentioned earlier, because it's something yastaqillu bihi ar-rajul, that a person can single-handedly carry it off and away. So the fact that a person can carry this cup off and away with them, they would call it a kulla. While the other ones, up until now, they've been called kulla because of their large size. It's a body of water or an amount of water that stands alone to itself. But here he says the eighth position is that a kulla can be said even about a mug. And this was mentioned by Qabisa from the students of Sufyan al-Thawri. He says that Sufyan al-Thawri, he prayed behind him in the month of Ramadan. Sufyan al-Thawri prayed behind Qabisa in the month of Ramadan. And then he took his sandals and a kulla that he had and left. And if I'm not mistaken, like Sufyan, he wouldn't pray witr with the imam. He would go out and, he would want to continue to pray. So he wouldn't finish with the imam. And so he might pray a couple of rak'at and then pray on his own. And so when he was ready to leave, he gathered his sandals and a kulla that he had, and he left. And so here we see them referring to a kulla as a cup that an individual could carry on their own. He has the sandals in one hand, he has his cup in the other hand, and this cup, what was the term that they gave to it? Kulla. And so we see here that this term, it's not something that we can use as an argument to determine large or small amounts of water. And this is going to become relevant when we talk about the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when water reaches to kulla, and what is the actual meaning of it if it's authentic. وَفِيهِ قَوْلٌ تَاسِعٌ. And there's also a ninth position. He says, قاله بعض أهل اللغة قال والقلة التي جعلت مقدارا بين ما ينجس من الماء وما لا ينجس هي مأخوذة من استقل فلان بحمله وأقله إذا أطاقه وحمله وإنما سميت الكيزان قلالة لأنها تقل بالأيدي وتحمل فيشرب فيها. He says there's a ninth position, and it is what was stated by some of the people of language. They say the kulla, which has been made as an amount to distinguish between water that becomes najis and that which does not become najis, i.e. by coming into contact with something that is najis. This word kulla is taken from the word istaqalla fulanun bihamlihi. So-and-so was able to carry it alone. وَأَقَلُّهُ إِذَا أَطَاقَهُ وَحَمِلَهُ. And the smallest amount of a kulla is that which a person is able to carry on his own, and he is capable of that. And the reason why mugs were called qilal or kullas is because an individual is able to carry it alone in his hand, and he is able to carry it to drink from it. And so that's why even cups were called kulla. Ibn al-Mundhir, he goes on, he says, قال والقلة تقع على الكوز الصغير والجرة اللطيفة والعظيمة والحب اللطيف إذا كان القوي من الرجال يستطيع أن يقله. قال جميل بن معمر فظللنا بنعمة واتكأنا وشربنا الحلال من قلله. He says, the people of language continue to mention, and you can see this in the book Lisan al-Arab by Ibn al-Manzur. He says the kulla, it can be applicable to the word to a small mug or a small cup, just as it can be applicable to an average bucket or a normal bucket, a smaller bucket, or a larger bucket, just as it can be attributed to a large pitcher or a normal pitcher, if strong people from the men are able to independently carry them. So the word kulla, it's a range, it's a spectrum, from something that can be carried by an individual in their hand to those big basins and vessels that maybe a large, strong man would be able to carry independent, but others might not. Because it can be carried independently, the word kulla still applies to it. And he says, just like it was said by Jamil ibn Ma'mar, a poet, he said, فَظَلَلْنَا بِنِعْمَةٍ وَاتَّكَأْنَا وَشَرِبْنَا الْحِلَالَ مِنْ قُلَلِهِ. He says, so we remained in the blessing and we relaxed, or we took shade, we took comfort in our enjoyment and we relaxed, and we drunk that which was permissible from its kuleli, from its containers. And so this poet is saying we were drinking that which is permissible from its kulla, from its container, i.e. they were passing it around. And so they used the word kulla for that which the hands could pass amongst themselves. Abu Bakr, he goes on, he says, we'll stop at that amount. That is the 9 opinions about how much is kullatain. Remember, we said as it relates to what is a large amount of water, there is disagreement. Some of them say it's kullatan, while others say something else. But the majority say a large amount of water is kullatan. And when it comes to how much is kullatan, there is disagreement. And so we've covered the disagreement about how much is kullatan. And so now we know that position. Some of them say that it's kullatan, that makes the water not able to become najis, that makes water abundant. And we know the disagreement about how much is kullatan. Now the author is going to mention the disagreement, the second position, other views about how much is a large amount of water. Not everybody says a large amount of water is kullatan. Some of them have completely different opinions about how much is a large amount of water. And so he'll mention who and what they say in this next section that we'll cover next time, inshallah. And all of this is part of the first view that when water reaches kullatan, it does not become najis. But if it's lesser than kullatan, then it's considered a small amount, and simply coming into contact with it makes it najis, i.e. coming into contact with the najaasah. And then after he mentions all of that, he'll mention the second opinion, which is what we deem to be the stronger opinion. And that is that unless the water changes, nothing makes it najis, even if it comes into contact with something that is najis. Unless its taste, color, or smell changes, it remains to be tahur. In any circumstance, we'll stop at that amount. هذا وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على عبده ورسوله نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. What oh no, that's not where is that where we started? What about still water that is a place of wudu in courtyards of the masajid in some Muslim countries? Leaves and other things fall into it, changing its color. So we're talking about najis water right now. Najis water, the taste, color, or smell have to change because of something najis. If the taste, color, or smell changes because of something pure, like leaves, for example, and other things that aren't najis, then depending on the circumstances, this is where the conversation between tahor water, water that is pure and purifying, and tahir water, water that is pure but not purifying, comes into play. And depending on the circumstances, from difficulty to protect it and other, various factors, would be what the different madhahib say. But to simplify it all, the view that I follow from the scholars in this issue is things that were adopted by, for the example, Ibn Taymiyyah, is that there are only 2 categories of water. All water is tahor. Nothing makes it najis. This is the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And the only exception to that is that which there is a consensus in, and that is that if water changes its taste, color, or smell because of something najis, it becomes najis. Besides that, all water is pure, no matter what state it's in, as long as it is water. Now, that comes with repercussions. That means you can't make tayammum when there's a puddle on the ground, because that puddle on the ground is water, and it's not najis unless it's najis. You can't make tayammum if there's a dirty creek, because a dirty creek is not najis. You have to make wudu, right? And, this is something that a lot of people, might be laxed about. But over time, like I say, it's a large issue. This is one of the bigger issues that start off the books of fiqh. So we'll talk about it step by step, stage by stage. How much is to kullah in today's measurements? Like we say, it's about 90 gallons. I'm sorry, 90 saw, which, if I'm not mistaken, it's almost approximately 40 gallons. About 40 gallons is a large amount of water, according to what the majority say kullatain is. But like we've just mentioned, somebody might say that two of these are kullatain. I'm sure the Arabs would have made containers to represent a kullah, just as they have containers to represent a saw for zakat al-fitr. Yes and no, because this saw right here, this particular one, its measurements and its dimensions were done by approximation. Right? Scholars, they would use different methods to determine how much is a saw. And based on some of those systems that they used, Ibn al-Qasim, he approximated them and did the math to come out with this type of container. And so this container, it has no chain connected to it. It has no authenticity equated with it. It's just his production of some of the systems that some of the scholars in the past would use, right? And a lot of the times they would use it by weight, not by volume, where it's a volume metric. There's another saw, there's another mud, right? This is a mud, because 4 of these should equal 1 of these. But you also have to know that scholars disagree about how many mud are in a saw. That's not something that's unanimously agreed upon. There's another type of mud. That there is a chain to, that they, the scholars have transmitted it by a chain. This is the saw of Zayd ibn Thabit. I'm sorry, the mud of Zayd ibn Thabit. But the chain, as you can imagine, is weak. There's no reliability upon the chain. But it's something that you find them, constantly transmitting and taking comfort in. And so if you have that mud, which is bigger than this one, by the way, it's about 1.5 this size. If you take that mud and you multiply it by 4, you would get a saw, because there's no saw by isnad. And this is because these were just containers and pitchers, handcrafted. There wasn't mass production. There wasn't machinery. There was just approximation. And so if I was to make a cast of this, it wouldn't be the exact same volume as this one. It would lose some because the cast would take a little bit out, right? And this is why you find, like, for example, waylun lil mutaffifin, like the religion gave so much importance to accurate measurements and weights. In any circumstance, so the statement that I'm sure the Arabs would have made a container to represent kullah, just as they made a container to represent a saw for zakat al-fitr, it's faulty. It's faulty because, one, they didn't make a container to represent a saw for zakat al-fitr. A saw was known during their time, and people made measurements and approximations to try to capture that information. But you also find that the religion was tolerant in that issue and simple in that issue. And it gave us those type of measurements that everybody could apply. A mud is this. Fill this up, that's a mud. Fill this up 4 times, that's a saw. And there's no harm in this approximation, right? Even though certain aspects of the religion are contingent upon this, like zakat, not just zakat al-fitr, but zakat al-mal and crops, right? You have to pay zakat for khamsati awsat, for 5 bushels of your crops, your produce. But a bushel, a wasaq, is 60 saw. And so you need to know how much a saw is to be able to know, do you have 300 of them to pay zakat? Do you have to pay zakat? But this is something that's done on approximation. So one, the Arabs, they did not necessarily make a container to represent a saw, and they let it be somewhat flexible. Just and as far as the qullah, likewise, they had their own qullahs that were known during their time. But as we see, different people had different qullahs, and you'll find that in fiqh. Different areas, like the people in Damascus, their saw is different than the saws of the people of Medina. And so you'll see them, well, half of a saw is all you need to give for zakat al-fitr, because they have different measurements. And these are things that we'll come across in due time, inshallah. Alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. What's the best form of salawat for Fridays? I don't understand. Ameen wa iyyakum, jazakum Allahu khairan, ameen wa iyyakum, barakallahu fikum. Subhanak Allahumma wa bihamdika, ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Is the mint to be measured using the male or the female's hand? An average size person's hand. Usually when things like this come undefined, the default is to go to an average size person. Not hands that are too big, not hands that are too small, just the normal size person's hand, right? And be concerned about the details of your religion, but be flexible where the religion was flexible, and be rigid where the religion encouraged you to be rigid. So in the issue of a saw, get as close as you can. Saddidu wa qaribu. Right? You know that it's 2 cupped hands 4 times. Right? A mud is 2 cupped hands, and a saw is 4 mud. So if you know this, do the best you can. And if you want to try to be more precise, then learn the statements of the scholars about approximately how much is this amount and how much is that amount. 2.04 kilos in a saw. But remember, a saw is a unit of volume, not weight. While most of the time when people want to pay zakat or something like that, they go by weight. This is contrary. So be flexible where the religion is flexible. Be rigid where the religion commands you with rigidity. Know the details and worship Allah to the best of your ability. When it comes to you having to pay zakat, remember, with sincerity, you don't have such a need for clarity, right? Be sincere to Allah. Learn what the religion says about something and do that, right? Try to find out what Salaf said this detail or another and do that, right? And if you maintain that methodology, then on the day of judgment, when you have to answer for your actions, you'll be in good shape. And that's all that matters. It doesn't matter what other people see you doing or what other people say about what you did. You gave cupped hands and, somebody criticized you. Oh, akhi, astaghfirullah. Didn't you hear Sheikh so-and-so say that a saw is 3 kilos? Akhi, I don't worship Allah based on what Sheikh so-and-so said. And it's not to disrespect Sheikh so-and-so, but how did he come up with 3 kilos? And is that definite or approximate? Like we just saw Shafi'i, one of the arguments against a Shafi'i is that how did he take the liberty to take the statement of Ibn Jurayj, which was 2 buckets and some change, qurbatayni wa shay, right? 2 buckets and something. How did he just make it 2.5 buckets? You just added something that you didn't have the authority to add. And then to bind the people to that. But the excuse for a Shafi'i is not that he's adding to the religion by making it rigid. He's just saying, better be on the safe side. Because I'm sincere. I'm going to give 2.5. And I know I'm giving extra, but it doesn't matter. But the problem is that when you state that extra, and then the next person comes and takes it as the minimum, and even worse, they come and put a little extra, and then they come and they put a little extra, like the people in Ramadan with Waqt al-Imsak and things like this. You see these type of things. So be flexible where the religion is flexible. Do I have to wait for the mu'adhin to say Allahu Akbar before I bite my date or drink my water in Ramadan? If I know the sun has already set, no, I don't have to wait. Do I have to stop eating 5 minutes before the adhan, or can I continue to eat until I hear the adhan, or until I know for sure Fajr has come in, even if I heard the adhan, right? Be flexible where the religion is flexible, and be rigid where the religion commands rigidity. Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى آل محمد. الصلاة الإبراهيمية. هذا هو دائم. This is always the best way to do it. طيب، سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.